Okay, so next week we have a busy week for NLG. On Monday, we are going to have a general membership meeting. And at that meeting, we're going to be talking about our Imagining Victory series as a whole. So talking not just about one of the events, but I think by that point we will have had 5 maybe. So we'll be able to sort of compare and contrast some of the different things we've heard and talk about our own visions for what it means to imagine victory. So that will be on Monday next week. And then on Thursday and Friday, we have a double header event that we're co-sponsoring with Balsa, and that is an event about reparations for American descendants of slavery. So that should be a very interesting 2 events as well at 4:30 on both Thursday and Friday next week. So I hope folks will join us for that. Okay, so today, as you all know, this is a continuing part of our Imagining Victory series. We're here to imagine not just what change seems possible in the bleak political moment that we're living in right now, but what we would do if we had the power to really achieve whatever vision we want to achieve. So the prompt that we've shared with all of our speakers to respond to is as follows. Imagine that you have the ability to single-handedly alter the laws of the United States so as to facilitate the creation of a just social order. Describe with as much specificity as possible the changes you would make to an area of law of your choosing. In laying out your vision, be both utopian and realistic. Be utopian in the sense of imagining that your maximum program for change can be fully realized and that any opposition can be overcome. Be realistic in the sense of imagining a legal framework that is actually enforceable, i.e. that would provide specific and meaningful guidance to courts and relevant government agencies. So I'm very excited to hear what Professor Verchick is going to say to us tonight in response to that. And now I'm going to pass it over to Grace, who's going to give an introduction to Professor Verchick.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome, Professor Verchick. Most of us are all students, but if you're not familiar, Rob Verchick teaches at Loyola University College of Law in New Orleans. Professor Verchick was originally born in Las Vegas and now lives in New Orleans. He teaches mostly environmental law, natural resources, and then I had him for property law as well for 1L courses. But Rob Verchick holds the Gartham St. Martin Chair Environmental Law at Loyola University. He is also a senior fellow at Tulane University's Disaster Resilience Leadership Academy. And also is the president of the Center for Progressive Reform, a national policy institute focused on public health, public welfare, and environmental protection. Professor Verchick served on the Obama administration as the Deputy Associate Administrator for the policy at the EPA in 2009 and 2010. And helped President Obama's administration with the Interagency Climate Change Adaptation Task Force. He also has done other policy research, including in New Delhi, as part of his different research as well. He holds an AB degree with honors and distinctions from Stanford and a JD degree cum laude from Harvard. Most of Professor Verchick's writing focuses on environmental regulation, climate change adaptation, and the developing field of disaster law. His work has appeared in many venues, including California Law Review, the Southern California Law Review, and the environmental law journals at Harvard, Stanford, and Berkeley. He has some books as well, which all of his information in further bio is on the Loyola University website. So without further ado, we would like to welcome you, Professor Verchick, and we look forward to hearing what your imagining victory sounds like.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me, and thanks for this prompt, which has led me to think in a number of ways. What I'll say is, as Grace said, one of the hats that I wear is I'm president of the board of the Center for Progressive Reform, which is a think tank based in Washington, D.C., that works on regulatory issues and environmental issues, social welfare issues. And I thought a lot about them as I was looking at this prompt, because at our think tank, we talk a lot about, number one, our theory of change, which is how we think that you affect meaningful legal and policy change in the United States. And then we think a lot about what that change should look like. So I'm going to be borrowing ideas from a lot of people in that organization, not just my ideas, and ideas that I've worked on with others in that organization before. So I'll say, I'll spend a few minutes talking, trying to answer your question as imperfectly as I will. And then hopefully maybe we can have a broader discussion, is my hope. I have two parts to what I want to say. The first, I think, is kind of obvious, and maybe you've had people talk about it, but if you haven't, I want to talk about it because I think that nothing else really matters unless we get the first part right. And the first part right is we have to acknowledge that in one of the oldest, the oldest by some counts, democracy in the world, we're very imperfect in certain ways. We are in a situation now where all three branches of government at the federal level are trapped by minority rule. And let me explain what I mean by that. The president, who's the head of the executive branch, did not win the popular vote. And that was perfectly legal, as you know, in our system. If you look at the legislative branch of government, the Senate, although the Democrats have the House, the Senate, more Democrats, let me say it this way, more people in the United States voted for Democrats for the Senate than voted for Republicans. But because of the wildly misappropriated way that we elect senators state by state, we don't have a one person, one vote system. And so I used to like this because I'm from Nevada, as Grace pointed out. And when I was a kid, I liked the idea that my mom's vote in Nevada counted, I don't know, 4 times the vote of a person in California. Today, Wyoming sort of is the good example of that. A person's vote in Wyoming is has 3.6 times more influence than a vote in California. There's no reason for that, right? I mean, the reasons are historical, and actually they have something to do with slavery and with the idea of trying to keep minority interests, not just minority interests in the eye of government, but actually to lead to minority rule. And so the Senate is a minority rule institution. The court is interesting. Look at the US Supreme Court now. 5 justices were appointed by presidents who did not win the popular vote. And so, and of course, we've got another one on the way. And so the top leadership of every branch of government in the federal system is a minority rule system. And it's not built to be that way. Because certainly it's not always been that way. In fact, the situation I'm discussing is kind of an unusual one, but it's perfectly legal and it's possible in our system. And I think that there's something deeply wrong with that, not just because I might happen to disagree with what the minority wants to do in these 3 branches of government, but because I think that it's just not sustainable to operate a government where the minority has no incentive even to win over any more voters. You know, to look at the president's reelection campaign, there's not even a pretense anymore of attempting to change people's minds to get to 51% popular vote. It's basically a strategy of gaming the system. Nobody, not even anybody on the president's team, expects him to win the majority. But as long as he can win a minority in a certain way, it's possible to hold on to power. And I think that the incentive there is, it just doesn't work, because I think that people won't stand for it at some point, because they won't see these branches as legitimate. So what would I do with all of that? Well, you know, people, I'm not saying anything you probably haven't already heard, but I think that abolishing either the electoral college or the winner-take-all system in states would be a way of ensuring that the president had the incentive to seek a majority of votes in the United States. Adding states might be one way of making up for the legislative deficit. We have at least 4 million Americans in the United States who have no representation in Congress at all. If you add the District of Columbia to Puerto Rico and to some of the other territories. And unpacking the court might be an interesting thing to think about at this point. We have a president who has now made use of 5 years worth of appointments in a 4-year term. If you count the, of course, Merrick Garland. And so that itself, right, is just an expression of the kinds of things that are allowed. And so I think that actually we could get quite far if we just change the system, the incentives in the electoral process. But what I'd like to do is share my screen for a moment and walk you through some thinking that I have been doing along with people at the Center for Progressive Reform. Some of this will be general, but it's going to be up to you to ask me for specifics when we get to question and answers. I originally, here, I'm just going to share my screen here. Let's see if I can back that up. Hold on. I originally had created this slideshow for the Center for Progressive Reform when we were looking for fundraising, and we were trying to come up kind of with a theory of where American politics had been and where we think it should be going. And we based this idea on social resilience. And I'm going to explain a little bit about what that is and why I think it matters. But first, I'm going to give you an example. All right. I mean, there's something fairly interesting in the green economy, I think. I mean, everybody agrees that the green economy should be a boon to everybody. It makes the environment, it helps us get the environment cleaner. It helps us avoid climate change impacts, which the consensus of scientists and many around the world insist, right, that it's true. And the other thing that's really interesting about the green economy is that by many accounts, it promises to create more jobs, right? 2 million jobs, this is according to a researcher at Stanford, 2 million jobs in the United States. So why isn't everybody, you know, sort of stampeding toward this? Well, the reason is, if you look behind the numbers, it means that 5.9 million jobs are going to be created and almost 4 million jobs are going to be lost. And those people who get the jobs are not going to be the people who lost the jobs, not necessarily anyway, right? And so you have to look behind these numbers. You have to look at something beyond the aggregate. And sure enough, you know, sort of what you see is that there are going to be states that have net job creation and states that have net job loss. Now, let me stop here and let you look at this very carefully, because what I want you to see is that in this picture, the state, just of the 4 that I showed you, that would have the most net job growth is Louisiana. We have the most to gain in jobs by getting rid of fossil fuels. Okay, and the way this works, all right, and this might be for another day, but the way this works is because of offshore wind power. We have enough offshore wind potential in the United States to provide enough electricity for half of all of our uses in the nation. And Louisiana is ranked second or third in terms of wind potential. All right. But we don't have a single wind farm in this state, onshore or offshore. The only wind farm that is currently running in the United States is off the coast of Rhode Island, and it is built, the leggings, right? Those platforms and the leggings that they stand on, the decking that holds those windmills on there, all of the ships and watercraft used to build it, everything I just described was designed and manufactured in the state of Louisiana. All right, because we have owned offshore platform technology for over 100 years, but we don't build it in our own state, right? We build it elsewhere. We build it in the North Sea. All of that technology is ours. So there's something wrong here, right? So why is it? And so one issue is sort of the why is it, and that has something to do with money and politics and the electoral disadvantage that I've already talked about. The other thing that it has to do with is that we have spent way too much time in politics thinking about the aggregate, thinking about these net jobs created, and not thinking enough about the jobs that are going to be lost, because these are people we should be caring about, right? So here's the point that I think is the major theme that I want to convey. You can think of all the things you care about at NLG as being either on the front end or the back end of social welfare reform. All right, on the front end is what I would call the regulatory state, but people hate that word, okay? The front end of government prevents harms before they happen, okay? Those are safeguards in the workplace. Those are pollution laws that keep kids from going to the emergency room when they have asthma. They're pollution laws that keep people's property values from being stripped away in places like Cancer Alley, all right? Because there's a lot of stuff going on that deprives people either of the value of their capital in their neighborhoods because they live in polluted places, or the value of their labor because they get sick or they get hurt, all right? And when you don't have as much capital and as much labor, you don't have as much revenue coming in. All right, so it's just classic economics. Labor and capital is what you have, right? And if you have a government, and it's the government's responsibility, right? Government's responsibility under our tradition, the government's responsibility to protect people's property and the assets they need to accrue property, right? Not just talking about government, your own health and welfare, but that's the basic idea behind government, right? Is to protect people's ability to provide for themselves, to have the capability to flourish and have a life that they value and that is worth valuing, right? The minimum we would expect from the regulatory state. Now, when you don't have that, or when it falls apart, you need help on the back end. And I call this the human needs state, if you will, right? But this is all of the part. This is healthcare. This is unemployment insurance. This is job training, all of these things, right? And one of the pieces that I wish for, one of the things I wish for is that these two pieces of government and also the groups that support them in the nonprofit world, I wish these groups would talk more together. All right, because at CPR, I've worked a lot on health regulations and environmental regulations, right? I've worked on something when I was at the EPA, worked on something called the silica rule. It was a rule that actually came out of OSHA at the very last minute that required more protection for workers who were cutting stone on the sides of buildings or sidewalks. You see folks, if you walk downtown or something, using these cutting devices, right? And all that dust comes up all right? And they can get terrible respiratory diseases, and people die from this. They get put on ventilators and they die, right, at 60 years old. So a guy who testified before Congress and actually had silicosis and died at one point, right? He was testifying. He lost all of his savings having to pay for this silicosis he had, even though he died. This money he had saved all his life was going to go to fund his kids' education, or it might have gone to help his kids when they become adults have a down payment on a house, or it might have gone to he and his wife in their retirement years. But instead, it went to hospitals, right? His wealth was stripped away. His wealth was stripped away because of this. And if we had been able, right, just to require face masks that cost a few dollars on the part of employers, then those kinds of problems wouldn't have happened, right? So having a connection between these two, seeing that environmental safeguards, worker safety safeguards, public health safeguards are the beginning of protecting people's welfare, right? You can't be, you have to be able to sort of look at both of these things. Now, we used to have a government, and I'm going to blame some of this on the liberal environmentalists in a minute, right? We used to have a government in the 30s and 40s in particular, where unions worked with what we would call then a nascent public health or environmental protection lobby of some kind. Everybody saw the common purpose, all right? And then something happened. And I know I'm not papering over, but obviously I'm not looking right now at the racism and the white supremacy, and there were a lot of things that colluded to make sure that people didn't get the protections that they needed. But there was an idea, right? An idea that that freedom and equality needed to be balanced in some way, because I think it was Adam Smith said, freedom for the pike is death for the minnows, right? So freedom and equality have to be balanced, because if one side just has all the freedom, the other side doesn't have the welfare, right? And for that, we have to sort of look at what it takes to create resilience within communities, the capacity to survive, adapt, grow in the face of misfortune and change. So let me just move. So why don't we have this, right? Well, there are a few things that happened from the 60s onward that that actually were as much I won't say as much mistakes made by liberals, but that were mistakes made by liberals that I want to call out, because I think that's important. I don't need to convince you of the role of white supremacy, perhaps, or of the role of libertarian thinking in all of this. But what I want to do is show you that there's another role within the left that contributed something to the problem that we're in. All right. And the problem in the left, I think, was this. First of all, around in the late 60s, early 70s, there was an enormous effort, as you know, put into the Civil Rights Acts. And that was perfect, right? That was a good thing. What we didn't do is think about what would happen if the Civil Rights Acts actually weren't able to solve all the problems. So I teach environmental justice. Some of you have heard me talk about it, the environmental justice issues. And one of the things I say frequently is that all the environmental statutes passed by Congress from the 1970s onward, all of them, were basically about health in the aggregate. They weren't about pollution pockets or poverty pockets that might get over polluted. And in fact, there's no mention in any of the statutes in environmental law anything about environmental justice or anything about racial equality or anything about equality based on income. You'll see that in regulations, you'll see that in some government policies, you'll see that in state law. You won't see anything in congressional statutes about that. Well, why not? Well, because in the 70s, honestly, I mean, there are at least three answers. Okay, one answer was people of very good intentions in Congress thought that was the role of the Civil Rights Acts. That the Civil Rights Acts, we're going to come in, we're going to get them in the early 70s, everything's going to be fine, we'll be done with that part of the whites, supremacy impacts, and we'll get on with life in some other way. And that's honestly it. I mean, you can read the legislative history of some of these acts having to do with the clean air or having to do with clean water. And there's talking, oh yeah, well, if there's a problem, the Civil Rights Acts will take care of that. Okay. So the second thing was around this time, there was a lot of emphasis placed on the power of litigation to solve problems. So again, the idea was, well, if poor folks are losing their property values or the air's not clean enough in one place, we'll just bring lawsuits and that will be corrected. And incidentally, that was the same idea that came out of the Civil Rights Acts too, because the Civil Rights Acts all depended on people being able to sue to get redress from discrimination or to stop discrimination, right? And what we found, right, surprise, surprise, is that people without power and people without resources don't have lawyers, right, and have a harder time getting where they need to be in a courtroom, because the courtroom is exactly the last place where they can expect to find a fair playing field. Okay, on the streets with a bunch of people, yeah, poor communities have lots of people sometimes. They have people who are willing to go out on the street and petition and march and these things. But in a courtroom, you need something else. And so the playing field is always stacked the wrong way. And you know this because you know what it takes, right, to get community lawyers out there. We don't have enough of them. So it's exactly the wrong thing for that reason. And then the third idea, which was particular perhaps to environmentalism and with public health, was this idea that if you're winning in the aggregate, you're winning from the point of view of social justice. If air is cleaner in the aggregate, or as the president says, it's pristine and immaculate and whatever, well, you know what? Our air on net is cleaner than it ever was. But there are some communities, including communities just a few miles down the road from me and you, that have dirtier air than they did 30 years ago, right? And as long as you can say, oh, in the aggregate, we're winning, then you can look the other way on these other things. And most of the environmental laws think about welfare in the aggregate. And a lot of our public health laws think about welfare in the aggregate. And so that's a problem. That's a problem. Now the new path, right? The new path would be a path that looks, I think, at the capability of people everywhere. That it's just not enough to say that in the aggregate things are better. We have to say, and think about that. I'm not just saying in the aggregate health, right? But I'm talking about that green economy too. Because it's easy for me to say, hey, in a green economy, we'd have 2 million more jobs. What are you complaining about, right? But you might say, well, I'm complaining about the people who are going to lose their jobs and not find another one, right? Because that's part of the same system, right? You can't brag about 2 million jobs created the same, if some people are going to be losing their jobs. You can't brag about having cleaner air than any time in the last 100 years if you still have people who are choking and going to the emergency room for asthma, right? You can't have those things. So you have to care about distribution. And I think that the way that we get to caring about distribution is creating systems within government and within the regulatory system in which agencies and enforcers are, in which they have incentives to pay attention to distribution. And so just to give you one example of something actually I worked on in the EPA, it's still available, is something called eChase Screen, where you can actually pick any state that you want, including Louisiana, and you can look at an overlay of the pollution and an overlay of the demographics. And this was originally designed for use for the EPA, so that if the EPA was determining where to put enforcement dollars, or if the EPA was thinking about where to give a grant, more grants for water treatment or stormwater management, they might look at a map like this and say, oh, here is a place, maybe in here, right, that could use more money, that could use more enforcement, that could use more technical assistance. And that way you would start evening out some of this. Just to give you one example, when I was at the EPA, there was a big debate about how much time to spend on Indian reservations. Now you might say, well, of course we should be spending time on Indian reservations. But the other side, right, liberal people, right? The other side was saying there are so few people on Indian reservations that if we went to Oakland and put some resources in Oakland, we'd be helping more people, right? And that's the issue, right? So how are you going to deal with that distribution? I think that the way you do it is you have to bake it right into the system. If you could open up some of those statutes, I would rewrite, you know, or suggest rewriting parts of the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, parts of the Endangered Species Act, which protects habitat and land, to reflect those kinds of distributional concerns. In the real world, I'm not advocating opening those things up, because I think that there would be a lot of shenanigans going on, right? A lot of people would want to change a lot of different pieces in ways maybe that wouldn't fit a progressive agenda. But then what I would say is you can build that in at the regulatory level. But you can't build it into a regulatory level unless you have a president who wants to, right? Who's appointing people who are willing to do that. In the Obama administration, there was a big move, the biggest move in the history of EPA, to bring distributional issues into the EPA, to bring distributional issues into the green economy and so on. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to stop sharing that. I'm going to share just one other thing just to show you. This is the think tank that I work with, and called the Center for Progressive Reform. And we've been around for 15 years. For the last 3 or 4 years, what we have been doing is making sure that everything we do in terms of water, in terms of worker safety, in terms of energy, in terms of regulatory oversight, everything we do is built around the idea of improving social resilience, of improving the ability of communities, the most vulnerable communities, to advocate for themselves, and to become involved in these regulatory processes. You know, people vote. I mean, we tell people to vote, right? People know how to vote. Most people, maybe some of you, don't know how to participate in a regulatory process, don't know how to write comments in a notice and comment period, right? That's a problem. You go to law school, you spend your whole first year of law school, and you may not even learn about how regulations are made. And regulations make up more of the law than anything else that we have. Regulations right, affect what your clothes are made out of. They affect the air that you're breathing inside of your building. Regulations affect the water you drink. They affect how your shoes are made. I mean, they affect the gases that are coming out of the compressed wood that your furniture is made out of, right? These are the laws. And most people have no idea how they're made. And one of the things we're doing at CPR is actually trying to train communities on how to become involved in the rule making, the regulation making process, because that's where the law is made. You know, it doesn't matter. I mean, your vote matters, but you can have so much influence in these ways if you just know how to get involved in the systems. And so that's kind of, you know, the things. I have a podcast here. Sometimes we talk about that kind of stuff. And we were looking at consumer protection, workers' rights, energy, and so on. So you should take a look at the kind of thing that we do, because I think probably more than anything else, that explains what my vision of a progressive movement is. And we're working, you know, really hard to try to say that, and in fact, we've got an initiative that is now titled what do we call it? Policy for social justice, or policy as social justice. These policies, these government safeguards, these regulations, if you want to use the dirty word, are the key to social resilience in this country. And so that's the pitch that I would make. I'm going to stop sharing and just open it up for questions or comments, because I'd love to learn from you to see what your reaction is and what you think the major issues are in our time.
Y'all mind if I get started with the real utopian option here?
Sure.
All right, so our scenario here, Professor Verchick, is that you are the administrator of the EPA, and there's a progressive faction of Congress that is getting things done. You're having a retreat and are coming up with the top 3 legislative and policy changes that you want to enact, and you will easily be able to. What are they?
Regulate greenhouse gases. Regulate greenhouse gases, work toward environmental justice, which is get a handle on the distributional effects, and make sure that the water is safe to drink.
How would you change the existing water standards that exist now to ensure that that happens? How would you change the Clean Water Act?
2 things. Okay, so one is I would strengthen some of the standards, but even more important than that, I would increase the budget. Let me tell you something that you might not know. EPA, here's something you do know, has a smaller and a shrinking budget than many agencies do. Maybe it's around maybe 8 billion, something like that, which might sound like a lot. But here's something you don't know. Half of the money in EPA's budget goes to the states. Half of the money, and that half that goes to the states mainly goes toward water treatment, mainly goes to either sewage treatment or the treatment of drinking water. That's how we expunged cholera from the United States, was essentially making grants, federal money available for communities to clean their water. And those grants are, as I'll say, you know, drying up, right? And that was the problem with Flint, not having enough money. I mean, there were lots of problems in Flint, but if they would have had enough money to properly control the water situation, they would have been out ahead. So it's making money available to states to do basic things. This is infrastructure, you know, water management. Okay, and what I would say about greenhouse gases, I mean, people are typically, I'm not sure One idea I have, obviously, is to put a price on carbon, and you can do that through a carbon fee, or you can do that through a cap and trade program of various kinds. What I don't think one should ever give up is the regulatory aspect of carbon emissions too. And that's something that I think that conservatives who are in favor of carbon taxes, they want to see that in exchange, but I don't think that would be the way to do it. But what you want to be able to do is I could rearrange something within there, I would go back to the idea of trying to use the Clean Air Act to push for green energy expansion. Yeah, in the same way that the Obama Clean Power Plan was attempting to do.
Thanks for getting utopian. It's really fun.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
I think we've been talking about in our environmental law class and constitutional law, I think it came up pretty much about Justice, that's the word I was looking for. Justice Neil Gorsuch is kind of averse to agency power, and I guess is interested in kind of returning that power back to Congress. What do you think the fallout would be? Let's say if, you know, there was some massive Supreme Court ruling that took a lot of agency power away and put that burden back on Congress. What do you think? Do you think that would be a good thing? Do you think that would be something terrible?
Oh, it wouldn't be good at all. So first of all, what I would say in response to the argument that Justice Gorsuch makes is, if he wants to give authority back to Congress, Congress has the authority, and they've already said what they want to do with it. They want to give it to experts to make these decisions. The problem you have when Congress is required to make these kinds of specific decisions is that they can never update things fast enough. Just to give you an example, the Clean Air Act requires that EPA review air standards every 5 years to make sure that they comport with what we know about health. And you won't be surprised to learn that every 5 years, every pollutant that you can think of, we have information showing that they actually affect health in stronger ways than we thought possible, right? Which is to say that the safe limit of lead and the safe limit of smog and the safe limit of all these things is always going down as we get more and more science, right? So thank goodness we have an agency whose job it is to be monitoring that and to say we're going to have to update our standards as is appropriate. If you were to wait for Congress to do that, Congress would have to open up these laws constantly, and there'd be bickering and nothing gets done in Congress, and so we'd be stuck with air standards that are 15, 20 years out of date. So I think that would be a very bad situation, and not what Congress would want, incidentally. Yeah.
So my question is, when we think about controlling pollution and emissions and also transitioning to a green economy, what do you see as the role of public ownership in that? Public ownership of resources, public ownership of utilities and energy production. How would you, like, in your scheme of how to administer the transition, what, if any, is the role of public ownership?
Well, it's a great question, and it's a complicated question. So if we're talking about federal lands, then I think that we need to make sure that they're not just owned by the federal government, but that they're adequately controlled by the federal government, and that we're getting a fair price on the leases, whether it's the lease of oil in the ground or whether it's the lease for space on which to build a transmission tower or space on which to build a wind farm on, Bureau of Land Management land. you mentioned utilities, and I think that's a particular situation. And it is often, I often run into people who think that the solution is publicly owned utilities, publicly owned public utilities, as we say, because most public utilities are privately owned. And I actually, I am not sure I care so much about who owns them. Utilities, as you may know, are highly regulated, no matter who owns them, because they're a potential monopoly. And I'm teaching energy law right now, and we had a board member of a privately owned utility called Portland General Electric, which is based in Oregon. He was talking to my class, and that's, I think, clearly one of the most progressive utilities in the country. They're going to be completely renewable, I think, by 2030. That they've closed every coal plant they've owned. And why? It's because they're serving a population in Portland, Oregon and around there that's very, very progressive. And as a private corporation, they're jumping on that. Who are the holdouts in the Pacific Northwest? Well, the holdouts tend to be publicly owned public utilities. Why? Because for all kinds of historical reasons, those publicly owned public utilities in California, not so much, let's just say in Washington and Oregon, are in rural areas where people are more conservative politically. And so it doesn't make them more progressive, and it doesn't necessarily make them more responsive to the people in general, although it might make them more responsive to their particular communities. I don't know if I answered you completely, but I'll stop there.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's take Louisiana as a prime example, where you have a ton of fossil fuel industry jobs.
Yeah.
And I know in a lot of situations here, if you try to have a conversation with someone about transferring those jobs into clean energy jobs, it's almost like a sacrilegious subject to talk about, and you're committing like a treason pretty much. What do you think is an effective way to have that conversation with people who are employed in that industry, whose families depend on, those jobs, to kind of incentivize them or inspire them to say, oh, hey, maybe this is a better option. I should, get trained in this kind of employment. How does that conversation start?
I think the conversation starts by talking about what everybody already sees, which is the tremendous costs we pay. We're losing our property in Louisiana to sea level rise. And so I think we start with the idea that there are some parishes that are literally slipping into the Gulf. Because of the economy that we have built. I actually think that we have, I am optimistic for this reason. There's a lot of research about job transfers and job transition. And a lot of it isn't good news, right? People who lose their jobs in coal mines aren't putting solar panels on roofs in Albuquerque next year, right? But one of the good news stories is that jobs in offshore oil are very transferable to offshore wind for reasons that you can probably imagine. Building an oil platform is not unlike building a platform for wind turbines, and retrofitting existing abandoned oil and gas platforms to serve in wind farms. That's another thing. And I think that we should have great pride in the engineering history of this state. Like I said, we invented this technology. We own it. And I think, I actually think that we have such a better case to make in terms of a transition than many places do, because, it's just a repurposing of a lot of that engineering technology. The other thing I'd say is that, if you look very carefully at the numbers, the state's revenue from oil and gas is much less than I think most people would think. And the number of jobs directly associated with oil and gas is much smaller than most people think. The largest sector of the economy in Louisiana is tourism. And that's completely dependent on a whole other set of offerings, right? Clean air, clean water, recreation, that kind of thing. So I think, in some ways it's about appealing to the values of people in this part of the country, in this part of the state, which is about saving your property and not looking out at your grandparents' farms or whatever, and just seeing open water. I mean, I think that's a kind of a powerful thing, and that's what I would focus on.
I want to share Swat's question, which is, are there any resources you would share with non-lawyers to empower awareness about environmental issues in their communities and the methods of redress?
Yeah, I think that educating communities about how the rulemaking process works and how they can become involved in it is enormously important. If you follow the environmental justice movement, I mean, you'll see that it started with a reaction toward, wanting better enforcement and pushing for better permitting, and those things are extremely important. You have a lot more leverage if you can get involved in the standard setting itself. And that's a harder ball game. It's a longer game for sure. It's occupied by lawyers now, and one of the things that I'm working with at CPR and would encourage others to try to work with as lawyers is push for changes that make that system more open to regular people, so that they can know what's going on and get involved in it and make their views known. And that's what I would focus on was, if we're trying to figure out like an opaque system, how can regular people get involved in the standard setting process?
If we wanted to learn about that standard setting process, like what class is that? I don't know.
It's environmental law, it's administrative law for sure, it's environmental justice. It's, I mean, this is a longer conversation about law school, but there's no reason students around the country should be going through their first year, should come out of their first year and not know how the system works, right? I mean, and it's just not you. I mean, it's just not Loyola. I'm here to tell you, it's almost everywhere. Yeah.
So then why do you think that is the case? If that is like from a academic perspective, you've been in academia for a long time.
Yeah.
Why is law school structured in a way that doesn't set you up to be able to actually do that?
Okay, so I'm going to give you the controversial political answer, and then I'm going to give you a practical answer that maybe is closer. Okay, the highfalutin theoretical answer is this: traditionally, for the last 100 years, law schools have focused in the first year on private law, which is the relationship of private people with other private people. It's the way that private people regulate each other, either through contracts or even through the tort system, all right, or through the property system, if you're a landlord and a tenant or whatever. So it's private people regulating other private people. One thing that you don't normally find in the whole first year of law school, except for criminal law, is the state. The state is non-existent. Right? or the state is just there as an umpire, making sure that private people treat other private people in some basically fair way. But the state doesn't exist. And it's a model that came out of the late 19th century when we had a very weak state. And the idea was that it was a libertarian idea that private people working with other private people would solve all the world's problems. And so after the New Deal, we kind of moved beyond that, but law schools didn't. And so my theoretical idea, right, is that it was people in power who had an interest in making it look like all of our laws were really just a libertarian dream of private people regulating other private people without the government, without the state really doing much. And it's not until the second and third year that you learn that we actually have a government, right? And that the government does things. that it's not a tort lawsuit that makes sure that your lawnmower is safe. It's government regulation that makes sure your lawnmower is safe. And so that's one thing. Okay, so so it's a neoliberal fantasy. The first year is your neoliberal fantasy, okay, of no government and just individual people making things work. The practical answer, okay, because I know I'm on tape, so I need to say the practical answer. The practical answer is that it's not just your law professors who think that. It's the drafters of the bar exam who think that, right? So as long as the bar exams are going to concentrate on private law, then that's what law schools are going to concentrate on too. And so when people like me, as I sometimes do with my colleagues, as I sometimes say, hey, why don't we get more administrative law and regulatory law into the first year? Then people say to me, hey, the last time I checked, administrative law and regulatory law aren't even on the Louisiana bar exam, right? Which should lead you to think a little bit about why that is the case, right? Because, and that's the case in many states. In many states, administrative law is not on the bar exam. It's as if government doesn't even exist on the bar exam in some ways, except in very narrow ways, right? Except in very narrow ways. And so, and then there's inertia and a lot of other things too. But I think that's the reason is in some ways we respond to the bar exam, whether we should or not. And the bar exam is very much a neoliberal instrument to protect the rights of people who have power.
All right, do we have one last question before we wrap up, y'all? Molly, I see you.
No, I had a question. It was really similar to Carlos's question, and so it was answered. So I'm good.
All right, well, we'll go ahead and wrap this one up. Thank you so much for coming, Professor Verchick. This was really great.
Thank you.
Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot. Do we have, you saw on our first slide, we have our upcoming events and things on there. You can see that on our Eventbrite for our next chat. Ben, you want to close it out with anything?
I'll just remind everybody of what was on that first slide, which is that next Monday at 5 p.m. we'll have our general membership meeting. And then that Thursday and Friday at 4:30, both days, NLG and BALSA are co-sponsoring an event on reparations for American descendants of slavery. If you're on the NLG email list, you will get reminder emails about those events. If you're not on the NLG email list, send us an email, nlg@loyola.edu, and get on the list. And that's all. Thanks for coming, everybody, and thanks, Professor Verchick. We'll see you all
Take care.
next time.
Be careful out there.
Thank you.